August 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. 200 Japanese prisoners who'd been taught Americans were barbarians sat staring at their first meal. The smell alone made them suspicious. But what sat on those metal trays would do more than fill their stomachs. It would shatter everything they'd been trained to believe. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka was 28 years old. He sat 3 rows back in the cafeteria, his hands folded in his lap, his back rigid despite the exhaustion that had lived in his bones for months. The man next to him, Private Kenji Yamamoto, was barely 19, his face still carrying the softness of adolescence beneath the grime and the hollow stare. Neither man spoke. Around them, 198 other Japanese soldiers sat in similar silence, waiting. They'd been in Camp McCoy for 3 days. 3 days of confusion. 3 days of treatment that made no sense. Tanaka had grown up in a fishing village outside Osaka. His father had worked nets until his hands were scarred leather. His mother had kept a small shrine, had taught him to bow properly, to honor his ancestors, to understand that duty was the highest virtue. When the war came, when the draft notice arrived, she'd wept but said nothing. He'd left home in 1941 with 1,000 other young men, all of them burning with purpose. The training had been brutal. Not just physically, though, that had broken some of them, but psychologically. The instructors had been clear, explicit. Americans were not like the Japanese. They were demons in human form. They tortured prisoners. They mutilated corpses. They wore the bones of enemy soldiers as trophies. The instructors showed photographs, told stories, built a mythology of horror. More than that, they taught the code. Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was ancient, they said, stretching back centuries to the samurai. Death before dishonor. Victory or suicide. Surrender was not just defeat, it was spiritual annihilation. A man who surrendered ceased to exist in any meaningful way. His family would be shamed. His name would be erased. Better to die with a grenade pressed to your chest than to raise your hands to an American soldier. Tanaka had believed it. Every word. He'd carried that belief to Saipan in June 1944. The island was small, volcanic, strategically vital. The Americans wanted it as a stepping stone to the mainland. The Japanese were ordered to hold it at all costs. Those costs turned out to be catastrophic. The battle lasted 3 weeks. By the end, the island was a moonscape. Artillery had turned the jungle into splinters. The beaches were red. The caves where Japanese soldiers made their last stands filled with smoke and screaming. Tanaka had watched men he'd trained with blow themselves apart rather than be captured. He'd seen officers commit seppuku in the traditional way, disemboweling themselves while their subordinates stood witness. He'd planned to do the same, but when the moment came when the American Marines were 20 feet away, when his commanding officer was already dead, when the grenade was in his hand, something in him hesitated. Not courage, not even fear exactly, just a microscopic pause. A flicker of doubt. That pause cost him his honor. The Marines stormed the position. Tanaka's grenade fell from his hand, unfused. He was thrown to the ground, zip-tied, dragged out into the sunlight. He waited for the bullet, for the bayonet, for the torture his instructors had promised. It didn't come. Instead, they gave him water. He'd stared at the canteen like it was a hallucination. The Marine holding it out was young, maybe 20. With sunburned skin and exhausted eyes. He pushed the canteen forward again, more insistently. Tanaka drank. The water was warm and tasted like metal. But it was water. Real. Actual water. He didn't understand. There were 63 of them who'd been captured on Saipan that day. They were processed, tagged, loaded onto a transport ship. During the voyage, Tanaka waited for the deception to end. The Americans were playing with them, he decided, making them comfortable before the real horror began. But the days passed, and nothing happened. They were fed. Not well, but fed. They were given medical attention. The wounded were treated by American doctors. Private Yamamoto, who'd been shot through the shoulder, kept asking Tanaka why the Americans were wasting medical supplies on them. Tanaka had no answer. The ship docked in California. They were moved by train across the country. watching America unfold outside the windows of their railway cars. The vastness of it shocked them. The cities, the farms, the endless fields of wheat and corn. This was the nation they'd been told was on the brink of collapse, starving, desperate. It looked nothing like the propaganda. Camp McCoy sprawled across rolling Wisconsin hills. Neat rows of barracks, guard towers, fences topped with wire, but no torture equipment, no execution grounds. The American soldiers walked casually, rifles slung over their shoulders, laughing with each other. They looked bored. The first night, the prisoners were given barracks assignments. The buildings were wooden, drafty, cold. But there were beds. Actual beds, with thin mattresses and blankets. Tanaka lay down that night and stared at the ceiling, his mind fracturing under the weight of confusion. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. The Americans should have killed them by now. Yamamoto, in the bunk next to him, whispered in the darkness, "Sergeant, why haven't they hurt us?" "I don't know," Tanaka admitted. Do you think the instructors were wrong?" Tanaka said nothing. To admit that felt like betraying everything he'd been. But the thought had already taken root. The second day, they were assigned to work details. Nothing brutal, clearing brush, maintaining the campgrounds, simple labor. The guards watched, but didn't beat them. Captain William Harris, the camp commander, a thick-shouldered man of about 45, walked the grounds each morning. He spoke to the prisoners through interpreters, explaining rules, expectations. He mentioned the Geneva Convention. None of the Japanese soldiers knew what that was. "You'll be treated humanely," Harris told them through the interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier from California. "You'll work, but you'll be fed. You'll have medical care. You'll be able to write letters home, within restrictions. You are prisoners of war, and you will be treated as such." Tanaka tried to understand what "treated as such" meant in American terms. In Japanese terms, prisoners didn't exist. You died before capture. If you didn't, you weren't spoken of. That night, some of the older prisoners whispered that this was psychological warfare. The Americans were softening them, trying to extract information, turn them into traitors. When the questioning came, they would resist. They would hold to their training, but no questioning came. By the third morning, a different kind of tension had settled over the 200 men. Not fear of violence, but fear of something more destabilizing. The fear that everything they'd been taught was a lie. That morning, Corporal James Roberts, a two-year-old guard from a farm outside Des Moines, walked through the barracks before dawn. He had an easy manner, a Midwestern friendliness that some of the prisoners found disturbing. He smiled when he spoke to them. He didn't seem to hate them at all. "Big day today," Roberts said through the interpreter. "You're getting your first proper meal." The prisoners didn't know what that meant. At 0800 hours, they were marched to the mess hall. The building was larger than their barracks, with long tables and benches. The smell hit them before they crossed the threshold. Cooking meat, bread, something rich and heavy and completely foreign. Tanaka's stomach clenched. He hadn't smelled beef in years. In the village, meat was rare. In the military, it was rarer still. Usually fish, sometimes pork, often just rice and vegetables. Beef was for special occasions, for the wealthy, for officers. Why were the Americans cooking beef for prisoners? The cafeteria doors stood open. Through them, Tanaka could see American soldiers moving behind a serving line, scooping food onto trays. Steam rose. The prisoners formed into rows, uncertain, watching each other for cues. Captain Harris stood near the entrance. He nodded to them as they filed past, his expression unreadable. Corporal Roberts stood by the serving line, gesturing for them to move forward. Tanaka glanced at Yamamoto. The boy's face was pale. His hands trembled. "What if it's poisoned?" Yamamoto whispered. "Then, we die," Tanaka said quietly. Better than this confusion, but he didn't believe that. Some part of him, growing louder each day, wanted to live, wanted to understand, wanted to know why nothing made sense anymore. The line moved forward. Tanaka picked up a metal tray. An American soldier, couldn't have been more than 18, placed something on it. The object was round, brown, sitting in a soft white bun. Meat protruded from the sides. There was a smell: char, fat, salt, something almost sweet. Tanaka stared at it. "What is this?" he asked the interpreter. The interpreter looked amused. "Hamburger. American food. You eat it with your hands." Tanaka had no cultural context for this, no memory, no reference point. He'd eaten rice balls with his hands, but this was different. This was beef, shaped into a disc, cooked, placed between bread. It seemed almost obscene in its abundance. Around him, the other prisoners received their trays. On each one, the same strange item. Some men also received vegetables, potatoes. The portions were large, larger than they'd eaten in months, maybe years. They moved to the tables and sat. 200 men holding trays, staring at food they didn't understand. Corporal Roberts walked between the tables. He picked up one of the hamburgers from a tray and took a bite, demonstrating. "See? It's good. Just eat." No one moved. Yamamoto looked at Tanaka. "Sergeant?" Tanaka looked down at the hamburger. The meat was still hot. He could see the grain of the ground beef, the way it had been pressed together, cooked until the outside was dark. The bun was soft, white, nothing like the dense rice they were used to. His instructors' voices echoed in his mind. "Americans are barbarians. They cannot be trusted. Everything they do is a trap." But those voices were growing fainter. He thought of the water on Saipan, the medical care on the ship, the beds, Captain Harris walking the grounds each morning, calm and professional. Corporal Roberts smiling, demonstrating how to eat. What if the barbarians were the ones who'd lied to him? The cafeteria doors swung open. The smell hit them first. Beef, fat, salt, something they couldn't identify. Corporal Roberts gestured toward the serving line. It was time. Tanaka lifted the hamburger. His hands were steadier than he expected. Around him, the cafeteria had fallen into an unnatural silence. 200 men holding trays. 200 men waiting to see what would happen to the first one brave enough or foolish enough to eat. The weight surprised him. It was substantial, warm through the paper, wrapping someone had placed beneath it. He brought it closer to his face. The smell intensified. Char, salt, something primal that made his mouth water despite his suspicion. He'd been hungry for so long that his body responded before his mind could stop it. He bit down. The first sensation was texture, the soft give of the bun, then resistance as his teeth hit the meat. Then taste flooded in, beef fat melting across his tongue, salt in a quantity he hadn't experienced in years. The char on the outside giving way to juice inside, the bread absorbing it all, becoming rich and heavy. It was overwhelming. Tanaka chewed slowly. His eyes widened. Around him, other prisoners had begun eating, watching him for signs of poison, for collapse, for whatever the Americans had planned. But nothing happened. Just flavor. Just sustenance. Just food more abundant and rich than anything he'd eaten since leaving his village 3 years ago. He swallowed. Took another bite. Beside him, Private Yamamoto bit into his own hamburger with trembling hands. The boy's eyes immediately filled with tears. Not from pain, not from poison, from something else entirely. His shoulders began to shake. "It's real," Yamamoto whispered, his voice breaking. "The food is real." Across the table, an older soldier named Corporal Sato sat frozen, the hamburger halfway to his mouth. He was 35, had fought in China before Saipan, had seen things that had carved deep lines into his face. He stared at the food like it was a ghost. "They're feeding us beef," Sato said, almost to himself. "Beef. Like we're..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Like we're human," Tanaka thought. "Like we're worth feeding." The idea was destabilizing. In the corner, near the serving line, Corporal Roberts stood with his arms crossed, watching the prisoners eat. His expression had shifted from casual to something more complex. Surprise, maybe. Confusion. He turned to another guard. A tall man with corporal stripes named Wilson. "They're crying," Roberts said, quiet enough that it didn't carry to the prisoners. "Why are they crying?" Wilson shrugged. "Hell if I know. It's just hamburgers." But Roberts was beginning to understand that it wasn't just hamburgers. Not to these men. He'd grown up on a farm outside Des Moines. His family had been poor, but not like this. Not starving. Not believing that the enemy would skin them alive if captured. He'd eaten hamburgers at county fairs, at church picnics, at the diner in town on Saturdays when his father sold enough hogs to spare a few dollars. For him, a hamburger was normal, common, almost boring. For these men, it was something else entirely. Tanaka finished his first hamburger. His stomach, shrunken from months of inadequate rations, felt heavy, full in a way he'd almost forgotten. But there were potatoes on his tray too, and what looked like canned corn. He ate mechanically, unable to stop now that he'd started. Around him, the cafeteria slowly filled with sound. Not conversation, not yet, but the noises of eating, chewing, swallowing, the scrape of forks on metal trays, here and there, quiet weeping. Some men ate with their heads down, shoulders hunched, as if ashamed of their hunger. Others ate quickly, frantically, like the food might disappear. Yamamoto had stopped crying but hadn't stopped eating. He worked through his meal with intense focus, his jaw moving rhythmically. When he finished, he set down his fork and stared at his empty tray. "Sergeant," he said softly, "I don't understand." "Neither do I," Tanaka admitted. "The instructors said Americans were savages, that they would torture us, starve us, make us wish for death." Yamamoto's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why are they feeding us like this?" Tanaka had no answer. The question had been growing in his mind for 3 days, but the meal had brought it into sharp focus. Everything he'd been taught, everything that had shaped his understanding of the war, of the enemy, of what it meant to be captured, was colliding with reality. And reality wasn't cooperating with the propaganda. A few tables away, an older prisoner named Lieutenant Nakamura stood abruptly. He was 42, one of the few officers who'd been captured at Saipan. His face was rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. "This is a trick," Nakamura announced in Japanese, his voice carrying through the cafeteria. Several prisoners looked up. "They're trying to break us, make us weak, grateful. They want us to forget our duty." Some men nodded. The explanation made sense to them, more sense than the alternative. Americans feeding them well out of simple decency? Impossible. But Tanaka wasn't sure anymore. Corporal Roberts had noticed the commotion. He walked over to the Japanese-American interpreter, a soft-spoken man named Private First Class Takahashi, who'd been raised in Sacramento before the war. His family was in Manzanar now, an internment camp, but he'd volunteered for military service anyway. His loyalty was constantly questioned, but he did his job with quiet dignity. "What's he saying?" Roberts asked, nodding toward Nakamura. Takahashi listened, then translated. "He thinks this is psychological warfare, that you're trying to trick them." Roberts frowned. He looked at Nakamura, then at the other prisoners, then back at Takahashi. "Tell him it's not a trick. Tell him we're following the Geneva Convention. Prisoners get fed. That's the rule," Takahashi translated. Nakamura stared at Roberts with open hostility. "There is no honor in being fed by the enemy," he said through Takahashi. "We should have died rather than accept this shame." Roberts' expression hardened. "Well, you didn't die. You're here. And while you're here, you'll be treated like prisoners of war, not animals, whether you like it or not." The exchange was translated back and forth. Tanaka watched carefully. Roberts wasn't angry. Exactly. More. Frustrated, like he was trying to explain something obvious that Nakamura refused to understand. But what was obvious to an American farm boy from Iowa wasn't obvious to a Japanese officer raised in a culture where surrender meant annihilation. Nakamura sat back down, his jaw tight. He didn't finish his food, but most of the others did. As the meal continued, small conversations began to emerge. Whispered discussions in Japanese, prisoners trying to make sense of what was happening. Some clung to Nakamura's interpretation this was a trick, a test of loyalty. Others weren't so sure. Corporal Sato, the older soldier across from Tanaka, finally spoke. His voice was rough, worn down by years of war. "I fought in Manchuria," he said quietly. "In China. I saw what we did to prisoners there." Tanaka knew what he meant. Everyone knew. The stories weren't secret, not among soldiers. Chinese prisoners were executed, sometimes quickly, sometimes not. The idea of feeding them, caring for them, treating them humanely, it would have been absurd. "If this is how Americans treat their enemies," Sato continued, "then what does that make us?" The question hung in the air. Tanaka didn't answer. Couldn't answer, because the question was too large, too dangerous. If the Americans weren't barbarians, if they were, in fact, more humane than the Japanese military had been, then what had the war been for? What had the thousands of deaths meant? What did his own dishonor in surrendering actually represent? The implications were too massive to process. Private Yamamoto had started crying again, quietly. Not from fear this time, from something else. Relief, maybe, or grief, or the overwhelming weight of cognitive dissonance. "I want to write to my mother," Yamamoto said, his voice thick. "I want to tell her I'm alive, that I'm being treated well. But," he trailed off, "but she'll be ashamed." Tanaka finished. Yamamoto nodded. In Japan, their families would have been notified that they were missing, presumed dead. That was the honorable story. Better to have a dead son than a captured one. If letters arrived saying they were alive in American custody, it would bring shame. The families would be ostracized. The men themselves would be considered traitors, cowards, failures. And yet here they sat, eating beef. The meal was winding down. Prisoners were finishing their trays, stacking them near the serving line as instructed. The American soldiers had begun clearing tables, operating with the casual efficiency of routine. For them, this was just another meal. Nothing special. Just feeding prisoners, same as always. Captain Harris entered the cafeteria. He walked slowly between the tables, observing. His presence commanded attention, but not through fear, through simple authority. He stopped near Tanaka's table. "How was the meal?" Harris asked through Takahashi. The question seemed so absurd that Tanaka almost laughed. How was the meal? It was beef. It was more food than he'd seen in months. It was everything the propaganda said Americans wouldn't give them. It was adequate, Tanaka said carefully, using the interpreter. Harris's mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Adequate. Well, that's honest at least. He paused, studying the prisoners. "I know this is confusing for you. I know you were taught things about us. About what would happen if you were captured." Tanaka said nothing. "But we follow rules here," Harris continued. "The Geneva Convention says prisoners of war are to be treated humanely, fed, given medical care, allowed to work, but not abused. That's what we do. Not because you deserve it. Not because we like you. But because we're better than the people who told you we were monsters." The translation came through Takahashi. Some prisoners looked down, uncomfortable. Others stared at Harris with open skepticism. But Tanaka felt something shift inside him. Not acceptance. Not yet. But a crack in the foundation of everything he'd believed. Harris nodded and walked away. The prisoners were dismissed. They filed out of the cafeteria into the bright Wisconsin morning. The sun was high. The air smelled of pine and distant farms. Guard towers stood at regular intervals along the fence, but the guards looked bored. One of them was reading a newspaper. It was all so mundane. Tanaka walked back toward his barracks with Yamamoto beside him. They didn't speak. Neither did most of the other prisoners. The weight of the meal sat heavy in their stomachs and heavier in their minds. That evening, as the sun set over Camp McCoy, Tanaka sat on his bunk and stared at the wall. Around him, other prisoners prepared for sleep. Some wrote letters they knew would be censored, words chosen carefully to avoid bringing shame to their families. Others sat in small groups, talking in low voices. Yamamoto climbed onto his bunk and lay down, staring at the ceiling. "Sergeant?" he said after a long silence. "Yes? Do you think the Emperor knows about how the Americans treat prisoners?" Tanaka didn't answer immediately. It was a dangerous question. Treasonous, in a way. But also fundamental. "I don't know," he finally said. "Because if he knew," Yamamoto continued, his voice small, "he would have told us, wouldn't he? He wouldn't have let us believe lies. Unless the Emperor didn't know. Or worse, unless the Emperor had known and let them believe the lies anyway." But that thought was too dangerous to speak aloud. "Get some sleep," Tanaka said. But neither of them slept much that night. In the darkness, Tanaka replayed the meal in his mind. The taste of the hamburger. The weight of it. The way Corporal Roberts had smiled. The way Captain Harris had spoken about rules and decency. The tears on Yamamoto's face. He thought about his village. His mother at the shrine, praying for his honor. His father working the nets. They believed he was dead. It was better that way. In their world, a dead son could be mourned with dignity. A captured son was no son at all, but he was alive, fed, treated, if not kindly, then at least humanely. And that hamburger, that simple, common American meal, had done more damage to his worldview than any battle. That night, in the barracks, no one spoke much. But something fundamental had shifted. They'd been fed dignity when they expected death. The war was still being fought thousands of miles away, across oceans, in jungles, and on beaches. Men were still dying by the thousands. Bombs were still falling. But for 200 men in a camp in Wisconsin, something else had ended. The lies had finally broken, and what came after the long, painful process of rebuilding their understanding of the world was only beginning. The hamburger had been just food to the Americans. To the prisoners, it was the first crack in everything. The weeks that followed moved with strange rhythms. Time in Camp McCoy didn't feel like time at war. It felt like something else, a suspended reality where the rules had changed, but no one had explained the new ones clearly. Tanaka was assigned to a work detail maintaining the camp grounds. Every morning at 0700 hours, he and 20 other prisoners would gather near the equipment shed. Corporal Roberts usually supervised. He'd hand out tools, rakes, shovels, pruning shears, and walk them to whatever section of the camp needed attention that day. The work wasn't hard. Not compared to digging defensive positions under artillery fire. Not compared to hauling supplies through Saipan's volcanic rock while American planes strafed the roads. This was just work. Ordinary labor. The kind his father had done every day of his life. What unsettled Tanaka wasn't the difficulty. It was the normalcy. Roberts talked while they worked. Not orders, exactly. Just talking. About his farm back home. About his younger sister, who wanted to be a teacher. About how Wisconsin winters were brutal and he wasn't looking forward to his first one. He spoke through Takahashi when necessary, but increasingly he'd just talk, and the prisoners who were picking up English would catch fragments. One afternoon in September, as they cleared brush near the southern fence line, Roberts paused to drink from his canteen. He offered it to Tanaka without thinking, an automatic gesture, the kind you'd make to anyone working alongside you on a hot day. Tanaka hesitated, then accepted it. The water was cool. He drank and handed it back. "Thanks," he said in English. One of the few words he'd learned. Roberts smiled. "You're getting it. The language." Tanaka nodded. He was trying. Not because he wanted to collaborate, that word still carried poison, but because understanding seemed important. Understanding was survival, in its way. "You got family?" Roberts asked, settling onto a tree stump. The question came through Takahashi, who was supervising nearby. Tanaka considered not answering, but the isolation was wearing on him. "Parents. In Osaka. Fishing village. They know you're alive." "No. Better they don't." Roberts frowned. "Why's that better?" How could Tanaka explain? In Roberts' world, in America's world, being alive and captured was unfortunate, but understandable. In Tanaka's world, it was erasure. But he tried. In Japan, captured soldier brings shame. Family shame. Better to be dead. Roberts was quiet for a moment. That's rough, Tanaka. That's really rough. It was the first time Roberts had used his name. Not prisoner or sergeant or just pointing. His actual name. Something small shifted in Tanaka's chest. By October, the camp had developed its own ecosystem. Prisoners who showed aptitude were given more responsibility. Some worked in the kitchens. Others helped with camp maintenance, laundry, administrative tasks. The guards and prisoners weren't friends. The war was still happening. That reality never disappeared, but a kind of functional coexistence had emerged. Lieutenant Nakamura refused to participate. He sat in the barracks most days, staring at nothing, eating only when forced. His rigid adherence to the old code was cracking him from the inside. Some of the other prisoners whispered that he was planning seppuku. Others thought he'd simply given up. Tanaka felt something different than Nakamura's paralysis. Not acceptance, not yet, but a kind of painful adaptation, like a bone healing wrong. Functional but never quite right again. Private Yamamoto had taken to following Corporal Roberts around. The boy asked questions constantly about America, about farming, about anything. Roberts seemed to find it amusing. He'd answer patiently, telling Yamamoto about crop rotation and harvest seasons, about going to picture shows on weekends, about baseball. "What is baseball?" Yamamoto asked one day. Roberts' face lit up. He spent the next 20 minutes trying to explain the sport. The prisoners didn't fully understand, but they grasped that it mattered to Roberts the way sumo mattered to them. It was cultural, identity-shaping. "Maybe after the war you could come see a game," Roberts said, then immediately looked embarrassed, like he'd overstepped. But Yamamoto's eyes had gone distant. "After the war, I cannot go home, cannot stay here, don't know where I go." The statement hung heavy. It was true for all of them. When the war ended, whenever that happened, they would be repatriated, sent back to a Japan that would reject them. They would be ghosts, men who should have died but hadn't. The shame would follow them forever. In November, the first snow fell. Tanaka had never seen snow. His village was coastal, temperate. He stood in the yard watching white flakes drift down, covering the camp in silence. It was beautiful, in a way that made his chest ache. Corporal Sato, the older soldier, stood beside him. "My son is 7 now," Sato said quietly. "I haven't seen him in 4 years. By the time I return, if I return, he won't remember me." "Will you tell him?" Tanaka asked. "About this place? About the Americans?" Sato shook his head slowly. "Who would believe it? I barely believe it, and I'm living it." That was the problem. The disconnect between what they'd been taught and what they'd experienced was so vast that bridging it felt impossible. They existed in a strange liminal space, no longer fully Japanese soldiers, not yet anything else. Christmas came. The Americans celebrated with elaborate decorations, singing, extra food. Captain Harris arranged for the prisoners to receive packages from the Red Cross. Simple things. Toiletries. Writing paper. Small comforts. Some prisoners wept when they opened them. Not from gratitude. From the sheer cognitive dissonance of receiving gifts from the enemy. Tanaka used the writing paper to compose a letter to his mother. He wrote carefully, knowing it would be censored, knowing she might never receive it, knowing that if she did, it would bring only pain. "I am alive," he wrote. "I am treated fairly. I think of home often. Please tend to father's nets. Please honor the ancestors. I am sorry for the shame I have brought." He couldn't bring himself to write more. In April 1945, the news came through official channels but also through whispers, through guards talking among themselves. President Roosevelt had died. The camp observed a day of mourning. The prisoners watched American soldiers grieve for their leader and felt strange witnessing it. These men who'd seemed invincible, casual, confident, they cried. They were human in their grief. Then May brought different news. Germany had surrendered. Europe's war was over. In the Pacific, the fighting intensified. Okinawa, Iwo Jima, islands Tanaka knew only as names. Places where men he'd trained with were dying by the thousands, following the code, refusing surrender, choosing death. He thought about that often. The men still fighting were honorable. He was not. But the men still fighting were also dead or dying. And he was alive, eating 3 meals a day, learning English, talking with Corporal Roberts about farming, which was actually honorable. The question had no good answer. August brought the end. The atomic bombs, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The Emperor's radio address, his voice transmitted across the nation for the first time in history, telling his people to endure the unendurable, surrender. In Camp McCoy, the prisoners gathered to hear the news through Takahashi. Some wept, some sat in stunned silence. Lieutenant Nakamura stood and walked to his bunk and lay down facing the wall. He didn't move for 2 days. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Tanaka felt a strange emptiness, relief, but also profound disorientation. What now? Who was he now? A soldier without a war, a prisoner without an enemy, a Japanese man whose country had abandoned the very code he'd been told was eternal. Repatriation began in September. The prisoners were processed, given basic supplies, loaded onto ships. The voyage back to Japan took weeks. During that time, Tanaka barely spoke. He stood on deck watching the ocean, thinking about the hamburger, that first meal, the moment everything had started to crack. Corporal Roberts had come to say goodbye. He'd shaken Tanaka's hand, a Western gesture Tanaka had learned, and said, "Good luck, Tanaka. I hope you find peace." Tanaka had nodded, unable to form words. Japan in late 1945 was a nation in ruins. Tokyo burned, Osaka damaged. The cities were ash and rubble and starving people. The emperor was still revered, but the mystique had shattered. MacArthur's occupation forces were everywhere. Democracy was being imposed from above. The old order had collapsed. Tanaka returned to his village. His parents were alive. His mother wept when she saw him, but there was shame in her tears. His father wouldn't meet his eyes. In the village, people whispered, "Tanaka-san's boy, the one who surrendered, the one who was captured." He tried to explain. About Camp McCoy, about the treatment, about Corporal Roberts and Captain Harris, about the hamburger. No one understood. "You should have died," his father said one night, drunk on cheapsake. Not cruel, just factual. It would have been better. Tanaka moved to Tokyo in 1946. The city was rebuilding slowly. Jobs were scarce, but he found work doing manual labor. He lived in a small room in a boarding house with 5 other men. He didn't talk about the war, but he thought about the hamburger. In 1952, he had saved enough money to open a small restaurant. Nothing fancy. A few tables, a simple kitchen. He served traditional Japanese food, mostly rice, fish, vegetables, but on the menu, he added one item that made no sense to his Japanese customers: hamburger. People asked what it was. Tanaka would explain. American food. Ground beef, bread, simple preparation. Some customers tried it out of curiosity. Most stuck with the familiar. But Tanaka made hamburgers every day. He was methodical about it. The beef ground fresh. The buns from a baker who'd learned Western techniques during the occupation. He cooked them the way he remembered: simple, straightforward, honest. It was his private ritual, his way of holding on to something he couldn't fully articulate. In 1963, an American journalist doing a story on post-war Japan found Tanaka's restaurant. The journalist was young, maybe 30, full of questions about reconciliation and rebuilding. He ordered the hamburger. "Why do you serve this?" the journalist asked through a translator. "It's not traditional." Tanaka considered his answer carefully. "In 1944, I was prisoner in Wisconsin. Americans gave me hamburger. First time I ate American food. First time I understood that everything I had been taught was wrong." The journalist's eyes widened. "Can I write about this?" Tanaka shook his head. "No. Private memory." But word spread anyway. Slowly. Locally. the restaurant that served hamburgers made by a former POW. Some people came out of curiosity, some out of respect, some out of their own need to process what the war had meant. Private Yamamoto visited once, in 1967. He'd survived, had found work in Yokohama, had married. He looked older than his 42 years. They sat in Tanaka's restaurant eating hamburgers, neither man speaking for long minutes. "Do you remember Corporal Roberts?" Yamamoto finally asked. "Every day," Tanaka said. "Do you think he remembers us?" "I don't know. I hope he does," Yamamoto said quietly. "I hope he knows that he changed us. That meal, that moment, everything." Tanaka nodded. He hoped so too. In July 1978, an American tourist wandered into Tanaka's restaurant. He was middle-aged, traveling with his wife, looking for authentic Japanese food. He ordered the hamburger almost as a joke. When Tanaka brought it to the table, the tourist looked up in surprise. This is just like home. How did you learn to make this?" Tanaka was 62 now. His hair was white. His hands were scarred from decades of cooking. He sat down at the table without being invited, a boldness he'd earned with age. 1944. "I was prisoner of war. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. American soldiers gave me my first hamburger. Changed my life." The tourist stared. His wife put down her chopsticks. "Changed your life?" the tourist repeated. "How?" Tanaka thought about how to explain. About the propaganda. About expecting torture and receiving food. About Corporal Roberts and Captain Harris, and the way simple decency had shattered everything he'd believed. About 34 years of trying to understand what it meant to be treated humanely by people he'd been taught were monsters. "I was taught you were demons," Tanaka said slowly, his English imperfect but functional. "But you gave me beef. You gave me dignity. You treated me like human. That meal," he paused, searching for words. "That meal taught me mercy, taught me that people are more than what they are told to be." The tourist's eyes were wet. "I served in the Pacific," he said quietly. "Okinawa. I saw terrible things on both sides." "Yes," Tanaka said. "War is terrible. But after war, we have choice. Be prisoners of hate or be free of it." The tourist took a bite of the hamburger. Tanaka watched him eat, and for a moment, he was back in Camp McCoy, 28 years old. Terrified, confused, holding something he didn't understand, tasting something that would unravel his entire worldview. "Thank you," the tourist said, and it wasn't clear if he was thanking Tanaka for the meal or for something larger. "No," Tanaka said. "Thank you. Your soldiers gave me more than food. They gave me truth." The tourist and his wife finished their meal and left. Tanaka watched them go, then returned to his kitchen. He had other customers to serve, other hamburgers to make, but that conversation stayed with him. That night, closing the restaurant, Tanaka stood in his kitchen holding a raw beef patty. He thought about Corporal Roberts, who would be in his mid-50s now, probably still in Iowa, maybe still farming. He thought about Captain Harris, who might be dead, or retired, or still serving somewhere. He thought about Lieutenant Nakamura, who'd hung himself in 1947, unable to survive the peace. He thought about the 200 men in that cafeteria in August 1944. How many were still alive? How many had found peace? How many still carried the weight of that cognitive dissonance? The hamburger had been just food to the Americans. A standard meal. Nothing special. They'd probably forgotten that day entirely. But for Tanaka and the others, it had been everything. The moment when the lies finally broke. The moment when they'd been forced to confront the possibility that they'd been wrong. Not just wrong about the war, but wrong about the fundamental nature of their enemies. Wrong about honor. Wrong about what it meant to be human. Food had been the weapon that defeated Bushido. Not bullets, not bombs, just beef and bread, and the simple act of feeding prisoners like they mattered. Tanaka placed the patty on the grill. It sizzled. The smell filled the kitchen. 34 years later, it still made something tighten in his chest. memory, gratitude, grief for the person he'd been before that meal, relief for the person he'd become after. He'd survived the war. He'd survived the peace. He'd survived the shame. And every hamburger he made was a small act of remembrance. A prayer, almost. A way of saying that mercy matters. That treating your enemies with dignity can change them more profoundly than any cruelty. The meat cooked. Tanaka flipped it. Outside, Tokyo hummed with life, a city reborn, a nation transformed, a people finding their way in a world that no longer made sense in the old terms. But in his small kitchen, Tanaka understood something the propagandists had never imagined. That humanity could be a more powerful force than hate. That a simple meal, offered without malice, could shatter decades of indoctrination. The hamburger was ready. Tanaka placed it on a bun. Steam rose. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he took a bite. The taste was the same. Beef, salt, bread. But the meaning had deepened with time. It wasn't just food anymore. It was history. It was transformation. It was proof that even in the darkest moments, people could choose kindness. And that kindness could echo across decades. Corporal Roberts had probably never known. Had probably never understood what that meal meant. Had probably just seen it as another day, another duty, another group of prisoners to feed. But for Tanaka, it had been salvation. And every hamburger he made was his way of saying thank you to a farm boy from Iowa who'd smiled at the enemy and handed him dignity when he expected death. The war had ended 33 years ago. The prisoners had become citizens. The enemies had become trading partners. The world had moved on. But in a small restaurant in Tokyo, an old man still made hamburgers, still remembered, still carried the weight and the gift of that August morning in Wisconsin. When meat became mercy, when food became truth, when simple decency shattered everything, and in that shattering, somehow, he'd found a way to be human again.